diversity, inclusivity, and equity, the DEI Holy Trinity, is a political policy movement predicated on the idea that Western society, and that would include Canada, is a corrupt patriarchy in its essence that marginalizes a variety of groups, and purposefully so, delegitimizing them, and that the appropriate response to that is to segregate and identify people on the basis of their group identity, and that would include race and sex and gender and all the other isms, all the other ism identities that you may have heard in the last 10 years, to divide people on the basis of those identities and to privilege the marginalized, to bring them to the center. Now, some of that presumption derives from postmodern philosophy, and some of it is essentially Marxist in its orientation. And so Carney's derivation of Canadian values, when the pedal hits the metal, let's say, or the rubber hits the road, the manner in which Carney translates his interpretation of Canadian values is the same manner that the radical leftists in the Democratic Party, for example, in the United States, translated the same value propositions. And that's to become an advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusivity, and to assume that human beings should be divided on the basis of their race and their sexual identity and their gender, etc., and that our culture is essentially oppressive at its core. And so I believe that idea to be discreditable across multiple dimensions of analysis, and it's certainly the case that it was roundly rejected by the American electorate in the last election cycle. And you can also see that the Democrats themselves in the United States are backpedaling rapidly on the DEI front because they realize that it's a losing game in the short, medium, and long run. And so the first thing we might note is that when Carney is trying to formulate policy, one of the sets of policies that he put forward include this discreditable and divisive DEI formulation that's been part and parcel of the maneuvers by intellectuals to tilt the entire political world in a radically revolutionary and leftist direction. Okay, now, Carney also points out that he's a free market advocate, but you see, this is a rather serpentine proposition because in his book, Values, Carney also points out that all things considered, although the free market is necessary, it doesn't really do a good job of valuing the world. So he points out, for example, that it's preposterous that Amazon, the company, is valued financially, economically, higher than the Amazon rainforest. And while that sounds good in principle, it's a very vague and foolish claim. What Carney is pointing out is that the free market system can't attribute a financial value to everything. And that and that's true, and it's a problem. But his solution is a technocratic solution, and understanding that helps us understand the implications of his educational pathway and his career. See, Carney, who has been a stellar advocate for the World Economic Forum policies, for example, believes that because the free market cannot adequately value everything, that it's up to a handful of highly educated elitist technocrats to step in and substitute central planning so that the inadequacies of the free market system are properly rectified. Now, the question that begs is, well, which experts, why those experts, what legitimacy do they have as, let's say, unelected bureaucrats at the UN or the WEF, or with regards to the Economic Union, the European Economic Union, what legitimacy do they possess to make those central planning decisions? And by what principles are they willing to value those things that can't be valued from within the free market system? Well, we already started to delve into that when we talked about the diversity, equity, and inclusivity provisions in Carney's thinking. But the answer to that you see, the answer to that points us in the direction of the most fundamental, appropriate critique of Carney's thought. So Mark Carney and his globalist compatriots genuinely believe that carbon overproduction constitutes an existential threat to humanity. Now, the IPCC, which is the UN body that delves into such things, has not recognized that there's any such thing as a climate emergency. There are climate concerns, but that's not the same as an emergency. And Carney recently claimed to eliminate the carbon tax from Canadian consumers, but that's a temporary pause, and he's transferred the carbon tax into the industrial domain so that it's hidden from Canadians, and he's going to continue to pursue it. Now, how do I know that? Because the primary idea in Carney's book, Values, is that the climate crisis, which translates into carbon dioxide overproduction, is so dire and existential a threat that every single financial decision that every individual and every institution across the world makes should be focused on the necessity to ameliorate carbon production above all else. And so make no mistake about it, even though Carney has taken steps to back off the carbon tax in Canada because of its radical and justified unpopularity, the fundamental axiom of his entire worldview is that human beings are locked in an existential battle with nature itself, and that we're a destructive force, and that we're overproducing carbon dioxide, and that's going to decimate the planet, and that we have to do everything we possibly can to ameliorate that threat, no matter what it takes. And so what that means for someone like Carney, who already believes that it's people like him that should be in control because of their superior intelligence and their better grasp of the realities of the future, it also means that he's facing the kind of existential emergency, carbon dioxide overproduction, that justifies any maneuver possible on the basis that, of course, he has to do that because, after all, he's saving the planet. And so he can do things like tell Canadians that he's dispensing with the carbon tax, which he hasn't done because it's still on the books and it's only a temporary pause, but he's still an avid advocate of net zero policies and believes, for example, and Canadians should very much listen to this, that 3/4 of the fossil fuel reserves in the world have to be left in the ground. Okay, and so he believes that we should approach net zero by the year 2050 and that it'll require a $2 trillion investment on the part of Canadians in order to make that happen.
Look, we can't stabilize the climate unless we get to net zero.
And so we're doing progress, but we're going at it slowly.
Well, we're doing progress. We need to accelerate it. We want to stop coal, not just new coal, but stop use of coal by 2030.
And just to put that in perspective, that's about $300,000 out of your family's pockets, right? So that's what Carney's planning. He's planning to charge you $300,000 to move Canada towards net zero by 2050. Now, let's take that apart a little bit, because you might say, well, if the planet's in serious trouble, then everything is up for grabs and we're going to have to spend that money because there's going to be a catastrophe. And the first question would be, well, is that catastrophe impending? And the second question would be, even if it is that the right plan? So let's answer the first question first. And I would say that there isn't a catastrophe impending. Far more people die from cold weather than from warm weather. And there's no evidence whatsoever that an emergency is at hand. And the other thing I would say about that is that the biggest piece of data pertaining to the carbon issue that's emerged reliably over the last 20 years is the global greening phenomena. So what's actually happened as carbon dioxide levels have risen for whatever reasons, and some of that might be human caused, what's actually happened is that semi-arid areas around the world have become more green, and by a lot. So the planet is actually 20% greener than it was 30 years ago, despite the prognostications of people like Al Gore. And there's a very specific reason for that. And the reason is that plants love carbon dioxide, so it can hardly be regarded as a pollutant. And it turns out that if carbon dioxide levels are elevated, even slightly, as they have been in the last 100 years, let's say, plants can breathe more easily. Okay, well, so what? Well, so you get more plant growth and more plants. And if you're a fan of green, like the Greens hypothetically are, and the environmentalists, you'd kind of think more plants would be better. And we see about a 13% increase in crop production in consequence of that, by the way. And so there's 20% more vegetation worldwide, but it's also mostly green in the most noticeable way in semi-arid areas. Now, you heard the prognostications that as the climate warmed, that the deserts would expand, but actually exactly the opposite is happening. Semi-arid areas around the Sahara Desert, for example, are shrinking. And the reason for that is that as carbon dioxide levels go up, because plants can breathe more easily, the breathing pores that they use can shrink in size because they don't have to be as open to pull in enough carbon dioxide. And that means that they lose less water. And that means that they can grow in drier areas. And so now the reason I'm telling you all that is because there are effects of carbon dioxide increase, and some of them might be troublesome and some of them might be beneficial, but there's no evidence whatsoever that there's an emergency. And I think a very strong case can be made, for example, that we were at historic lows in terms of carbon dioxide proportion in the atmosphere across a 500 million year period, right? So now and 50 years ago, our atmosphere had the lowest concentration of carbon dioxide that's been recorded in 500 million years. So that's a long time frame. We're getting close to the point where plants were actually going to have to struggle to breathe because the carbon dioxide levels were so low. And so now they've increased somewhat and plants are having an easier time, and our crops are about 13% more efficient in